to Veronica for that introduction. We've worked closely together in your work with the Alzheimer's Society. I know how passionate you are to stop our NHS going backwards. We all know you'll make a brilliant MP for Elmet and Rothwell. And we need you in Parliament after the 7th of May to stand up for your constituents and vote for our jobs guarantee for young people, vote to repeal the Tory NHS privatisation legislation, and to vote to scrap the unfair and hated bedroom tax. And thank you to all of you for coming along today on this beautiful morning, giving up your bank holiday, although there is a general election on. We all know this is set to be the closest and most important election for very many years. And what better place to talk about why Britain can't afford 5 more years of the Conservatives than here in Leeds, where 5 years ago we threw out a failing Tory Liberal Democrat coalition. It's a city where, despite George Osborne heaping much bigger cuts on policing, on our fire services and on our local government services than many other parts of the country, Leeds Council, led by Keith Wakefield, have been leading the way in the north, bringing the Tour de France to here, bringing Google to Leeds, investing for the future, and also just a fortnight ago getting an outstanding mark for our local children's services. But I want to talk today about why here in Leeds, in Yorkshire and across the United Kingdom we can't afford 5 more years of the Tories. And with today marking the start of the tax year, I want to set out the true impact of this government's changes over the last 5 years, including the tax changes which come into effect today, which means that millions are paying more while millionaires are paying less. I want to set out why George Osborne and David Cameron are planning to do the same again if they win the election in a few weeks' time. And I want to set out Labour's better and more balanced, fair plan, which will put working people first and save our National Health Service. First, this Tory-led government's record. David Cameron and George Osborne are going around the country now, including today, telling people you've never had it so good. How out of touch can you get? The truth is, millions are worse off because of this government's record. Working people are seeing year after year their bills going up faster than wages. That means earnings after inflation are down £1,600 a year since 2010. But it's not just wages which have been squeezed. Families and pensioners are paying more because of the VAT rises, David Cameron's first broken promise. And millions of people have had their tax credits and childcare support cut too. The rise in VAT alone has cost a couple with children £1,800 over the last 4 years. And that's according to the Treasury's own figures. Childcare support for working parents was cut by £1,560 a year because of reductions to the childcare element of the working tax credit. On the bedroom tax, 500,000 people across the UK have been hit. 7,000 paying the bedroom tax here in Leeds, 45,000 across Yorkshire, and more than 3 million families, including 40,000 here in Leeds, 300,000 across our region, have seen their tax credits cut in real terms over the last few years. David Cameron and George Osborne are today telling people they've raised the personal allowance. But what they won't admit is that for millions of working people, the rise in VAT more than wipes out any increase in that personal allowance. It's the same old story with the Tories. Give with one hand and take much more with the other. Families are £1,100 a year worse off on average. That is the true cost of a Tory Chancellor, as our poster shows today. These are independent figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which take into account all the changes David Cameron and his government have introduced from May 2010 to today, including the change to the personal allowance. This is what the independent IFS says. Tax and benefit changes introduced by the coalition have reduced household incomes by £1,127 a year, or 3.3% on average. The IFS also exposes how families with children have been hit hardest. This is what they say. For middle and higher income families with children, loss of tax credits and child benefit has more than offset the effect of income tax cuts. And their damning conclusion is this: low income households with children lose the most as a percentage of their income from changes implemented by the coalition. But while millions are paying more, we know that millionaires are paying less. Do you remember when David Cameron and George Osborne said, "We're all in this together"? You don't hear them say that anymore. Because 2 years ago, they gave the top 1% in our country a £3 billion a year tax cut. A £3 billion a year giveaway to those on the highest earnings, while millions are paying more. For someone with an income of £1 million, that's a tax cut of over £85,000 over the last 2 years. For someone earning £5 million, it's a tax cut of £485,000. For someone earning £10 million, it's a tax cut of £985,000. That famous omnishambles budget of 2012 didn't just try to introduce the pasty tax and the caravan tax. It was the final confirmation that these are the same old Tories on the side of the few, not the many. As the Tory MP for Harlow, Robert Halfon, now George Osborne's own parliamentary private secretary, said just a few weeks before that 2012 budget, he said cutting the 50p top rate of tax would allow our opponents to recharacterise the Conservatives as being the party of the rich, for the few, not the many. The signal that such a tax cut would give to the public, many on average wages of £20,000, struggling with rising prices, would be that Conservatives are looking after vested interests. And Mr Halfon was right. The mask slipped that day, as David Cameron and George Osborne ditched the idea we're all in this together and looked after their friends first, cutting the top rate of tax for the very highest earners while raising VAT on families. It's the Tory way. As we say, millions pay more while millionaires pay less. And let's look at what another 5 years of the Tories will bring. Only yesterday, George Osborne repeatedly refused to rule out cutting the top rate of tax again for the very richest. David Cameron refused to rule it out as well. We know that is their secret plan, another big tax cut for millionaires. How can it be fair when here in Leeds, across our country, people are struggling £1,100 a year worse off? How can it be fair to have a tax cut for the very richest when our NHS is in crisis and going backwards? How can it be fair when we need to get the deficit down and the Tories are now planning deeper spending cuts in the next 3 years than in the last 5? We know David Cameron originally wanted to cut the top rate, not to 45p, but down to 40p. Just last year, Tory Mayor Boris Johnson urged the Tories to, and I quote, open up some more blue water and cut the top rate back to 40p. That's why they won't rule it out, because they're secretly planning to do it after the election. And if they do, it would mean an even bigger tax giveaway for the highest earners. For someone earning £1 million, it would be a tax cut of £340,000 over the next Parliament from those Tory cuts to the top rate. Someone earning £5 million would get a total tax cut in the next Parliament of £1.94 million. Someone earning £10 million would get a total tax cut of £3.94 million by 2020. And for all the embarrassment for David Cameron, as one of his Yorkshire Conservative parliamentary candidates defects to UKIP today, during the election campaign, a huge blow for David Cameron, we all know the truth. UKIP and the Conservatives have got the same policies to privatise the National Health Service and give tax cuts for the very richest. No wonder David Cameron and George Osborne won't rule out a Tory-UKIP coalition after the election. We know the Tories and UKIP are preparing to work together. And now David Cameron should stop ducking the questions, Is he planning a Tory-UKIP coalition, yes or no? While millionaires will pay less if the Tories get back in, we also know that millions of working people will end up paying more. In last month's budget, the Tories confirmed plans which go well beyond simply balancing the books. Plans for extreme spending cuts which are a grave threat to our living standards and to our public services. As the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility said, these budget plans will mean a sharp acceleration to cuts in public spending. They mean deeper spending cuts in the next 3 years than we've seen in the last 5 years. In fact, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies said, those budget plans mean spending cuts after the election twice as deep as anything we've seen so far in this Parliament. Just think what that would mean to policing, to defence, to social care, to the local services people rely upon in our country. And the Tories have promised £10 billion of unfunded tax cuts. Tax cuts where they still have not told us where they're going to get the money to pay for them. That's why people will conclude the only way for the Tories to get their sums to add up will be to cut the National Health Service and put up VAT again after the election. Of course, the Tories are going to deny they want to raise VAT again. David Cameron's desperate and panicky promise not to raise VAT at his last Prime Minister's questions is going to fool nobody in our country, because we've heard it all before. In 1979, the Tories said, before the election, they had no plans to raise VAT, and then they almost doubled it straight after the general election, a broken Tory promise on VAT. In 1992, John Major told the House of Commons before the election there will be no VAT increase. But a year later, he put VAT on gas and electricity bills, a Tory broken promise on VAT. In 2010, during the election campaign, David Cameron told the British people he wouldn't put up VAT. This is what he said: "We have absolutely no plans to raise VAT," said David Cameron. "Our first budget is all about recognising we need to get spending under control rather than putting up taxes." And we know what he did just a few weeks after the general election. He and George Osborne put up VAT, raising VAT from 17.5% to 20%, hitting the living standards of millions of people, a Tory broken promise on VAT. The Tories break their promises on VAT again and again and again. That's why people won't trust these Tory promises on VAT. Because rather than asking those with the broader shoulders to make the biggest contribution, VAT and a rise in VAT has always been the Tory tax rise of choice. As I said, at this election, the Tories have got £10 billion of unfunded tax promises, which they can't explain how they're going to pay for. Everybody knows the only way they'll make their sums add up is through a rise in VAT after the general election. £10 billion is the equivalent of a further 2% rise in VAT. The Treasury's own figures show that would mean a tax rise of £360 a year for a couple with children, a VAT rise of £1,440 over the next 4 years. Tory governments always raise VAT. They did it last time, and given another chance, they'll do so again, hitting pensioners and working people hard. It's the Tory way. Millions paying more, while millionaires pay less. But it doesn't have to be like this. We need a better plan. Because while millionaires are paying less, millions of working people are paying more under this government. And therefore, in our manifesto, Labour will make these clear commitments to the British people. We will not raise VAT. We will not raise national insurance. We will not raise the basic and higher rates of income tax. And Labour can make those manifesto commitments for our manifesto for the next Parliament, because unlike the Tories, all of our promises are fully funded and paid for. Where we need to raise extra revenue, Labour's better plan has set out how we will do so. So we'll have a mansion tax on properties over £2 million, a levy on the tobacco companies, and close tax loopholes to save and transform our NHS with 20,000 more nurses, 8,000 more GPs, and cancer tests guaranteed in a week. We'll have a one-off tax on bank bonuses to fund a paid starter job for every young person out of work for 12 months or more, which they'll have to take. We're not going to go ahead with a further cut in corporation tax, and we're going to use the money instead to cut and then freeze business rates for small companies. We're going to reduce the amount of tax relief given to the highest earners to pay for a cut in tuition fees to £6,000, cutting not only the burden of debt on graduates, but the national debt as well. We'll reverse the Tories' top-rate tax cut, the tax giveaway for millionaires, to help us get the deficit down in a fairer way. We'll close loopholes, we'll scrap the Shares for Rights scheme so we can pay for scrapping the hated and unfair bedroom tax. And we'll have a higher bank levy to expand free childcare for working parents with children aged 3 and 4, increasing free childcare from 15 up to 25 hours to help make work pay and balance work and family life for parents. All our plans are fully costed and paid for. None of our manifesto commitments will require a single pound of extra borrowing. Not a single pound of extra borrowing. What a contrast to the Tories. With their 10 billion of unfunded commitments, and with the Institute for Fiscal Studies dismantling and discrediting their totally false claims about Labour last Monday, it's now clear why David Cameron and George Osborne have been so desperate to block our plan to allow the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility to independently audit the manifesto commitments of our party and all the main parties in our manifestos. It's a Prime Minister and a Chancellor running scared of their record and running scared of scrutiny too. And we'll do one other thing too. We'll scrap the perverse and unfair marriage tax allowance and make a fairer choice instead. This marriage tax allowance is supposed to be David Cameron's flagship tax policy, his flagship family policy. But the Treasury's own figures show 2/3 of married couples and 5 in 6 families with children won't be helped by it. Women abandoned by their husbands, widows, women who fled from an abusive partner will get no help from David Cameron's plan, and 84% of the benefit from his family policy goes to men and not women. So we'll scrap that policy and we'll use the money instead to introduce a lower 10p starting rate of tax, which will help more married couples, more women, more families and more working people, a Labour tax cut for millions of people on middle and low incomes in our country. It's all part of our plan to back working families who are struggling after 5 years when bills have risen faster than wages. Expanding free childcare for all working parents of 3 and 4-year-olds to 25 hours. Increasing the minimum wage faster than earnings, rising to £8 an hour before 2020. Giving tax breaks to firms who pay the living wage. Banning exploitative 0-hours contracts, ensuring that workers who work regular hours get a proper contract. Freezing energy bills so that bills can fall but not rise, and giving the energy regulators tougher powers so that when wholesale costs fall, bills for families and pensioners fall too. Backing first-time buyers and dealing with our housing crisis by getting at least 200,000 homes a year built, as Ed Miliband said on Saturday. A better and fairer plan for millions, not just millionaires. Because Labour knows when working people succeed, Britain succeeds too. So this is the